Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the mothers of invention. I got a few photos up at the top, and we're going to talk about some of these ladies and some of their contributions. So a lot of times women's ideas like the cotton gin, automatic sewing machine, and even the Brooklyn Bridge have often been attributed to men, or their contributions weren't acknowledged. And this program is going to explore women's inventions and achievements. So in the Smithsonian Institute, there is a portrait, and it's called Men of Progress. And it was commissioned by John Lawrence Mott in 1856. And if you look at these men of progress, you can see that for the most part, they are men, of course, and mostly white, middle-aged. And so they're considered, and their contributions are important, and they did contribute a lot. So I'm going to talk a little bit about who's in this portrait. So in 1857, the inventor of the coal-burning stove, who is Jordan Mott, commissioned Christian Schlemihl to paint a group portrait of 18 American scientists and inventors who had altered the course of contemporary civilization. And we're going to talk about a few of the people that are in this photo. There is William Thomas Greene Morton, and he was a dentist and a physician who was the first publicly to demonstrate the use of inhaled anesthetic during dental procedures. So that is an important progress. James Bogardus, he was an inventor and an architect and a pioneer of the American cast iron architecture. Samuel Colt, he invented the Colt revolver. And there's even Charles Goodyear. He was a chemist who engineered the first vulcanized rubber. And of course, you know, we have car tires, so thank you. An American industrialist and philanthropist Peter Cooper, he founded the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art. So as you see, there are a lot of great scientists here, and so they're considered the men of progress. So now I'm going to start talking about some women of progress, women who may have originally come up with ideas for inventions or contributed to them and are not necessarily thought of or given the credit. And the first person I'm going to talk about is Catharine Littlefield Greene. She's considered the brain behind the cotton gin. Now, Eli Whitney is credited with the invention, but to say a few words about Catharine Littlefield Greene. In 1892, she had rented a room out to a Yale graduate, Eli Whitney, whom she encouraged to work on his inventions. Greene explained to Whitney the difficulties of raising green seed cotton, and it said that she may have encouraged Whitney to create a machine that could clean the cotton. And some say Greene financed the patent and fabrication of the machine, but others suggest that Whitney partnered with a Yale graduate, Phineas Miller, who owned a cotton plantation on Cumberland Island in Georgia. So according to the National Archives, Greene's support, both moral and financial, were critical to Whitney's efforts. In 1883, Matilda Jocelyn Gage had written a pamphlet called Woman as Inventor, and she explains why Greene did not attempt to patent the cotton gin herself And she also suggests that doing so would have exposed her to the ridicule of friends and a loss of position in society, which disapproved of women's involvement in any outside industry. Littlefield's contribution to the invention of the cotton gin were not documented at the time, so it's kind of a controversy. Did she come up with the idea? Did she finance it? It's not really documented, and she did not receive any patent credit for that, but she did know an awful lot about how to run a plantation and about difficulties of cotton and getting it separated from seed in order to make it useful. So she may have talked to Eli Whitney about all the struggles that you would have with cotton and how to invent a machine that would make it much more convenient to process those seeds out. So we're going to talk a little bit about Emily Warren Roebling. She had a lot to do with the Brooklyn Bridge, although she wasn't the main architect. That would be her father-in-law and her husband. She did contribute a great deal to getting the Brooklyn Bridge built. So the Brooklyn Bridge opened in May 24th, 1883, and it was the longest suspension bridge on the earth at the time. And it took 14 years of construction by some 600 workers, an estimated 27 of whom died in the process. So in 1865, Emily married the civil engineer, Washington A. Roebling, who was the son of the German-American architect, John A. Roebling. And he was a man known for designing suspension bridges, most famously the Brooklyn Bridge. And when the construction began in 1869, the elder Mr. Roebling had his foot crushed in the pilings of a Brooklyn pier when a barge came in the dock, according to the New York Times. He contracted tetanitis and he died less than a month later. So his son, Washington A. Roebling, who was Emily's husband, he took over next the project. And while he was down under the water with the casings, with the caissons to hold up the bridge, he came up to the surface too quickly, and he got what is known as the Bentz, which is a sickness that you get from surfacing from deep water too soon. And some victims become paralyzed, blind, and deaf. He became bedridden at that time. So then his wife, Emily, she took over the management of the project, and she went back and forth to the construction site. And she negotiated the supply materials. She oversaw the contracts and acted as a liaison to the Board of Trustees. And since she was the only person to visit her husband during his sickness, Emily Roebling relayed information from Washington to his assistants and reported to him the progress of the work of the bridge. She developed an extensive knowledge of the strength of materials, stress analysis, cable construction, and calculating the curves through Washington's teaching. So her husband taught her a lot about these topics that are coming very handy for building a bridge. And she complemented her knowledge by her prior interest in the study of bridge construction when her husband had been appointed as chief engineer. And for the decade after Washington was confined to his sickbed, Roebling was dedicated to the completion of the Brooklyn Bridge. She took over much of the chief engineer duties, including day-to-day supervision and project management. Emily and her husband jointly planned the bridge's continued construction. And she dealt with politicians, competing engineers, and all those associated with the work on the bridge, to the point where people believed that she was behind the bridge's design. Now, she really wasn't behind the design, but she was a liaison between her husband and the construction crew. And in 1882, Washington's title of chief engineer was in jeopardy because of his extended illness. To allow him to retain his position, Emily lobbied for him in meetings with engineers and politicians to defend her husband's work. And to Roebling's relief, he stayed as the chief engineer. It took 14 years and by some 600 workers to reward her for all of her efforts and for being a major part of the construction. If a visitor is walking the Brooklyn Bridge today, they should keep their eyes open for a plaque on the bridge honoring all three of the Roeblings. And it reads, "Back of every great work, we can find the self-sacrificing devotion of a woman." So with her help, the bridge was completed. All right, let's talk a little bit about sewing machines. So this is where it gets a little complicated and murky about who gets credit for what here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Elizabeth Howe and Catharine Maria Haley, Caroline Garcin, and Helen Blanchard. So a little bit about the sewing machine. Some historical sources state that Eli Howe's wife, Elizabeth, was the one that actually invented the sewing machine in 1843, even though Howe is given the credit. Some historical sources credit Isaac Mederit Singer's wife with the invention of the sewing machine that he patented in 1851. And I'm sure we've all heard of Singer sewing machines. Helen Blanchard, well, she invented the zigzag sewing machine that is on display at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. And what a zigzag stitch or an overseam stitch would do would strengthen the edges of a product of goods such as silk scarves and wool to make them stronger and help hold together. So the zigzag sewing machine invention is credited to men, Singer, Nietzsche, or Fauf, all of whom introduced the concept at a later date. Sewing machine companies waited for Blanchard for her 1873 patent to expire because they didn't want to pay her royalties when they went into main production of sewing machines. So they were waiting for her patent to expire so then they could jump on the invention and profit from it. And they certainly didn't want to pay Blanchard for royalties for her patent. So I'll talk a little bit about Caroline Garcin, and she had a clockmaker friend, and she is credited with inventing the automatic or single pedal sewing machine. So if you've seen really old sewing machines, there are actually two pedals that both, either foot has to press back and forth to get the machine to operate. And she did it with just a single foot pedal. Primarily women were the ones manufacturing sewed goods and materials for consumption. So she found an easier way with the single pedal rather than have both feet going at the same time. So let's talk a little bit about Helen Augusta Blanchard. She is known as the Lady Edison. She had 28 patents issued in her name between 1873 and 1915. And her inventions were all practical. They were commercial products and processes, zigzag sewing machine. She also made surgical needles, hat making machines, and back in those days, hats were very fashionable, so it made it a lot easier to make hats. She also invented a pencil sharpener. So if you've ever seen those old hand crank kind of pencil sharpeners, well, she came up with that idea to put the pencil in and use the hand crank with the blades to sharpen pencils. She started inventing and her own business when her father died and the family had lost their fortune. So unfortunately, she never married and didn't have children, so her story is kind of lost to the ages. Some of her inventions were improvements upon the original sewing machine, her zigzag sewing machine. In 1873, one of her improvements was to create a way to form a buttonhole stitch. And she also had a way to sew the end of seams to give them strength and to keep them from unraveling. Also, she made an improvement in elastic seams for garments and to make a strong elastic stitch that could give like stretchy fabric for a better fit without having to alter clothing. She also had a way to improve the elastic goring in shoes, and that's where when shoes are sewn together, especially leather shoes, that she found a way to keep them, the shoe pieces together in a series of rows of stitches that help the shoes have a longer life to them. She also invented a spool case, and the invention is a simple cover for spools for silk, cotton, and thread that protects the spool from becoming dirty, damaged, or unwound. So that helped, especially when you're manufacturing a lot of clothing. She also invented a sewing needle that was an improvement by making it possible to thread the needle with one hand for efficiency. And this is done by adding a latch that allows the needle to open, making it possible for the user to place a thread in the slot instead of threading it through a hole. And I find it's really hard to thread that needle if the lighting's bad, or if it's really small, it's hard to do that. So she invented a thing where you could just lift the latch, put the thread in, and then close the latch. Her invention for the surgical needle was an improvement. There were previous surgical needles, but the needle has a lancet point, which allows it to pierce skin easily with the minimal resistance, and therefore less pain to the patient. There was a notch on the back side of the needle that allows the thread to disconnect from the needle by just withdrawing it from the skin, so then you don't have to cut it or find other ways, so it was less painful. And most of her things were ways to improve sewing machine and things around sewing, but also the surgical needles for less pain to patients. So let's talk about Matilda Bentz. She invented the modern paper filter for coffee system. She didn't like the way the percolators were prone to overbrew the coffee, or espresso type machines at the time tended to leave grounds in the drink. And I really hate when the coffee grounds get in the coffee. And what they did use was like a linen bag that were filters, but it was really hard to clean them because you would have all that used coffee in there, and then you'd have to get all the used coffee grounds out and then rinse it really well and then try to use it again, and very time consuming. So in 1908, she invented the modern paper filter coffee making system. And what she had seen was one of her sons was using blotting paper for his schoolwork, which is an absorbent paper. They would be using pen and ink back then and blot up the extra ink. But she saw that and she thought that that might help with the coffee making process. So what she had done was she took a brass pot and she punctured it with a nail and then put that over top of another pot, and then took that blotting paper and made a paper filter out of it. So then you could put the dry coffee grounds in there and then drip the coffee through to the bottom container. And then the company was put on hold for a little while during World War II. But before that, in 1928, the demand for the products for the coffee pots and filters was so high that they ended up having a factory with 80 workers, and they had to work in double shifts to keep up with demand. And they couldn't have any, this was in Germany, so they couldn't find a good production facilities. So they actually moved to Minden in eastern Westphalia. And by that time, they made 100,000 filters. And the Melitta Corporation is still in operation today. So she's not really given quite enough credit for what she accomplished by revolutionizing the way that making drip coffee was performed. She also founded her own company, and she built an empire for her family to keep alive and running to this day. And right now, the grandchildren of Melitta Bentz are still in control of that company. So she had taken her idea and really built a great future, and a great future for people who enjoy coffee in the morning and don't want to go through all that fuss and don't want to get the grounds in it, and it's very convenient. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about Ada Lovelace. She's considered the first computer programmer by some. She was the Countess of Lovelace. She was an English mathematician and writer, and she was chiefly known for her work with Charles Babbage. He proposed a mechanical general purpose computer that he called the analytical engine. So in 1835, she married William King, who was made Earl of Lovelace in 1838. And that, of course, made Ada become the Countess. So Ada was really good at mathematics. She pursued that at the encouragement of her father. She described her approach to mathematics as poetic science and herself as an analyst and metaphysician. As a teenager, her mathematical talents led to a long working relationship and friendship with fellow British mathematician Charles Babbage, and he is considered the father of computers. So Babbage worked to develop an analytical engine, and Ada had translated an article by an Italian military engineer named Luigi Membrera, and it was a calculating engine. And she had translated the notes from Italian to English, and she was actually supplementing his works with her own elaborate notes. And Her notes are considered to be the first computer program. What she did was made an algorithm, and it was designed to be carried out by the machine. And her notes about the analytical engine went beyond calculating and number crunching. And she was interested in how individuals in society relate to the technology as a collaborative tool. So some considered her the first programmer, but that is also a controversy to her contributions. Some people just believe that she was a transcriber, that she really didn't develop the software. So she's referred to as the first computer programmer, but some biographers and computer scientists and historians of computing claim otherwise. For example, Bruce Collier, who later wrote a biography of Babbage, wrote in his 1970 Harvard University PhD thesis that Lovelace made a considerable contribution to publicizing the analytical engine, but there is no evidence that she advanced the design or the theory in any way. So a lot of people think that maybe she didn't do as much as she did. And so that allows for some controversy. But the fact that she wrote so many notes in the margin and added her own ideas to what a computer could do. The analytical engine was a precursor to the computers we have today. And she saw them more than just a calculator that could do things with numbers. She thought that they could do many, many other things. So she was kind of a visionary in the idea that she thought that computers could go a long way to improving society and doing more than just mathematical calculations. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about Fannie Farmer. She developed modern recipes and measurements, and her famous cookbook in 1896, the Fannie Farmer cookbook, as it's known later, was the Boston Cooking School cookbook. So she introduced the idea of standardized measuring spoons and cups and the concept of level measurements. So usually recipes before that time, before she standardized them, were like a pinch of this, a handful of that, kind of like when you're trying to learn something from your grandma, how to cook something, and of course she knows, and she's done this over and over again, and maybe a handful of this, maybe her hand is bigger than yours and doesn't quite work because maybe you need 2 handfuls where she would only need 1. She developed a standard set of cups, and the idea to level off the dry ingredients, like a cup of flour would be leveled off the top, not a heaping cup or a heaping tablespoon. So she went a long way to standardize things and to write a recipe in a way that the ingredients and the measurements and the cooking times and the things would be standardized, so anyone that knew how to read a recipe could read any recipe if it was written that way. She also provided some scientific explanations of chemical processes that occur in food during cooking, and she also standardized those measurements. And before the cookbook's publication, other American recipes frequently called for amount of a piece of butter or the size of an egg. Well, what size is that egg? Is it small? Is it extra large? A teacup of milk. Well, maybe I have a bigger cup than you do. So it really wasn't standardized, and whose size, what cup would make recipes be off from one to another if they weren't standardized. So that is what her contribution was. She had gone to the Boston Cooking School, which was famous. She went there and learned a lot about cooking, developed this cookbook. And in 1902, she created her own school, Miss Farmer School of Cookery. And she began by teaching gentle women and housewives the rudiments of plain and fancy cooking. But her interest eventually led her to develop a complete work of diet and nutrition for the ill, titled Food and Cookery for the Sick and Convalescents, which contained 30 pages on diabetes. So she was kind of ahead of her time to see how nutrition played a role in helping conditions and diseases. She was invited to lecture at Harvard Medical School, and she began teaching convalescent diet and nutrition to doctors and nurses. And she felt so strongly about the significance of proper food for the sick that she believed she would be remembered chiefly by her work in that field as opposed to her work at household and fancy cookery. Farmer understood perhaps better than anyone else at the time the value of appearance, taste, and presentation of sickroom food to the ill and people with poor appetites. She ranked these qualities over cost and nutrition value as importance. So the idea of presenting the food or presentation to make the food look more appealing to perhaps get people that were sick, that had little or no appetite, to feel better about eating the food. Okay, now we're going to move on to Beulah Louise Henry. She was an American inventor, and she received 28 patents between 1873 and 1915. And she was known as Lady Edison because of her many inventions. And you probably all know about Thomas Edison, so this is to be the counterpart. I guess it was a compliment to be known as Lady Edison. So they were quite happy with all of her inventions. So some of her inventions include a bobbin-free sewing machine and a vacuum ice cream freezer. That sounds pretty awesome right about now. Some ice cream would be great. She received 49 patents and had around 110 inventions in total. And one of her quotes is, if necessity is the mother of invention, then resourcefulness is its father. And she also wrote, I invent because I cannot help it. New things just thrust themselves upon me. So she had a lot of great ideas. And this is a partial list of her inventions. She invented in 1952 continuously attached envelopes for mass mailing. So you could just feed them one and one and one after the other. They were all attached. You just keep typing and rolling them through the machine to type, like for mass mailing. She invented something called dolly dips, which were soap-filled sponges for children in 1929. She also invented Miss Illusion doll with eyes that could change color, and they could open and close in 1935. She invented a hair curler, a parasol bag, an umbrella runner shield, a poodle dog doll, a sealing device for inflatable bodies, a valve for inflatable articles like inflatable balls and such. She created a valve for that. She also came up with a duplicating device for typewriting machines. She made a multi-copy attachment for typewriters so they could make several copies at the same time of the same document. She also created a double chain stitch sewing machine. She produced a sound machine that could articulate sounds, a can opener, and direct and return mailing envelopes in 1962. So she had created many, many inventions, many practical things. Let's talk a little bit about the movie star Hedy Lamarr. She's known to be a great beauty, but she was also very intelligent. She made a lot of inventions as a hobby. One of her most important inventions was she had teamed up with a musician to make he was a composer, to make a radio guidance system for torpedoes. Torpedoes tended to be able to be jammed or interfered with. Their signals usually on one channel, and once the enemy knew what the channel was, they could destroy the torpedoes or make them shoot off target or any number of things that would not be what was intended. And so she teamed up with her friend, and what they made was a frequency hopping guidance system, which is the precursor to Wi-Fi. The idea that you could jump from frequency to frequency and that the enemy wouldn't know, but the torpedo would, of where to go, what the instructions were. So she had drafted designs with the composer. And as he recalled, we began talking about the war, which in late summer of 1940 was looking most extremely black. Hedy said that she did not feel very comfortable sitting there in Hollywood and making lots of money when things were in such a state. And she said that she knew a good deal about munitions and various secret weapons, and that she was thinking seriously of quitting MGM and going to Washington, D.C. to offer her services. And as quoted from the 1945 Stars and Stripes interview, Hedy mostly admitted she did only creative work on the invention, while the composer and author George Intel did really important chemical part. Hedy was not too clear about how the device worked, but she remembered that she and Intel sat down on her living room rug and were using a silver matchbox with matches, simulating and writing of the invented thing. She said that at the start of the war. So there's a really good documentary called Bombshell. You can see it on the PBS app, and we also have the Canopy app here available at the library with your card, that you can also see the Bombshell documentary, which is her life story, but also explains a little bit about her wartime contributions. So, right, now we're going to talk about Bette Nesmith Graham. You may or may not know that Bette Nesmith is the mother of Michael Nesmith from the Monkees, the band, which I think is kind of interesting. A little trivia there. So she was a commercial artist and a typist. And back in the day, it was really difficult to erase mistakes that you made with a typewriter, because you had to actually roll it back and forth in the machine. And if you try to erase it out, sometimes you put a hole in the paper. And she had difficulties typing. She wasn't really a great typist at all. So in the wintertime, she would do Christmas displays for some of the holiday windows at department stores. And what she realizes, when you were painting the lettering on these windows, that an artist never corrects by erasing, but always paints over the error. So she decided to use what artists use, and that was some tempera paint. And she put it in she put it in a bottle and took her watercolor brush to the office and used it to correct her mistakes. So Graham secretly used her white correction paint for 5 years, making some improvements with the help of her son's chemistry teacher at the Thomas Jefferson High School in Dallas. Some of her bosses didn't like that she was using the corrective paint, but her coworkers loved it and they wanted her paint out. So eventually she began marketing her typewriter correction fluid as Mistake Out in 1956. The name was later changed to Liquid Paper when she began her own company. So she started out in the 1960s. She was operating at a small loss. She was making it at home, and it was also her company's headquarters at that time. And as the product became an indispensable tool of the secretarial trade, Nesmith relocated production and shipping from her kitchen to a 10-foot by 26-foot portable metal structure in her backyard, where she was packaging, shipping, and she was doing everything from her yard, from her own home, from this building in her backyard. She did end up selling the liquid paper to Gillette Corporation for $47.5 million in 1979. And before that, her company had employed 200 people, and it made 25 million bottles a year of the liquid paper. Okay, I'm going to talk about another invention, very practical and useful invention. So Marian Donovan, she invented the disposable diaper. She was a new mother and decided that it was inconvenient for these cloth diapers because it would wake a baby up. If they became wet, baby's sleep would be interrupted. The clothing would get soaked, the bedding would get soaked, everything would need to be changed. So she first started out by making something that she called boaters, which were these overcloth pants that were made of parachute or plastic. And they went over the cloth diaper to prevent leaking. She improved that with snaps over safety pins that might possibly poke a baby's skin. And those went over those cloth diapers. Then she started to get frustrated and she came up with an idea for making waterproof diapers, which would be the precursor for what we know as disposable diapers now, which have changed over the years. So again, she didn't like when the cloth diaper got everything wet. She would like to come up with something that would prevent baby's clothes and the bedding and everything from getting wet. So at first she created that boater, which was a pair of plastic pants that snaps over the cloth diaper. But no manufacturer was interested at first. So she decided she would go to Saks Fifth Avenue, and she went and sold the diaper to the store directly, and they started carrying it and then it started to become popular. So she made more and more, and then she created the disposable diapers. She started using a special composition of paper that is both absorbent but pulled the moisture away to prevent diaper rash. So eventually, from going to nobody interested in her product, she had sold her idea to Procter & Gamble in 1961 to make Pampers. And so that became a real convenience, modern convenience, and a great invention for modern people to be able to work and babies not to get wet. Okay, so that's a little bit about some ladies who contributed to inventions or helped contribute some very modern bridges and things that really, really help in society and to foresee things like Wi-Fi and computers and ways that they can be used in the future. So a lot of forward thinking women, a lot of great inventions, practical and useful inventions for industry and for the home.